A ruthless businessman, accustomed to dominating the corporate world, sees his life take a dramatic turn when, after saving a young girl from a fire, he discovers she is his daughter, the result of a past relationship he abandoned out of fear of commitment. Now he is confronted not only with unexpected fatherhood, but also with dark secrets tied to the fire and his corporate empire. As he faces conspiracies, rivalries, and a past that haunts him, he finds in his relationship with his daughter a chance for redemption, an intense story about second chances, the transformative power of love, and the courage to change when everything is at stake. The city of New York pulsed under the artificial glow of nightlights when Richard Miller finally left his office on the top floor of the imposing mirrored building of Miller Developments. The clock showed 11:45 p.m., another day that extended far beyond business hours. For him, this was not the exception, but the rule. After all, empires are not built on conventional schedules. At 45, Richard had achieved everything he had ever desired. He was recognized as one of the most successful businessmen in the country. His company was among the largest in the real estate sector, and his personal fortune was estimated in billions. The price of this ascent, however, was etched on his face, cold eyes, an always serious expression, and a posture that discouraged any personal approach. "Mr. Miller, don't forget about the investors' meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m., reminded his secretary, Sarah, one of the few people who still remained in the office at that hour. "Have I ever forgotten any appointment, Sarah?" The response came dry, almost harsh. "No, sir, never." Sarah lowered her eyes, accustomed to her boss's cutting tone. Richard adjusted his impeccable Italian tie and headed towards the private elevator. His driver was already waiting for him in the garage, as every night. But something made him dismiss the man. "You can go home, Charlie. I'll drive today." The driver hesitated for a moment, surprised by the change in routine, but didn't dare to question. Richard got into his latest model Mercedes-Benz and left the building, plunging into the New York night. Something was bothering him, an uneasiness he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the phone call he had received earlier from his father, Augustus Miller, the family patriarch and original founder of the company. "We need to talk about the future of the company, Richard. About your future," his father had said, with that voice that always sounded like a judgment. As he drove through less busy streets, trying to escape the thoughts that pursued him, Richard found himself in a neighborhood he didn't usually frequent. The buildings there were older, less imposing than the skyscrapers of the financial center. That's when he noticed a strange commotion up ahead. A crowd had gathered in front of a 5-story residential building, and the orange glow illuminating the night left no doubt. There was a fire in progress. The flames consumed part of the second floor, and smoke escaped through the windows like black serpents slithering against the night sky. Richard parked the car, and for some reason he didn't understand, got out. The chaos was widespread. People were screaming, others were crying, and the first fire trucks were beginning to arrive. It was then that he heard a scream that chilled his spine. "There's a child up there on the second floor." His eyes fixed on one of the windows where a girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, appeared and disappeared amidst the smoke. Something inside him, something that had long remained dormant, awakened in that instant. Without thinking twice, Richard ran towards the building. People tried to stop him. Voices shouted for him to wait for the firefighters, but he didn't hear. He climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time, protecting his face with the Italian suit jacket that cost more than a popular car. The heat was intense, and the smoke made it difficult to see, but he managed to reach the second floor. The apartment door was locked. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, Richard kicked it down. He found the girl huddled in a corner of the living room, hugging a teddy bear. "Come with me," he shouted, extending his arms. The girl hesitated for a moment, her large brown eyes fixed on his, before running towards him. Richard picked her up and began to descend the stairs, now more slowly, protecting her as much as he could. When they finally exited the building, they were greeted by applause and cries of relief. Paramedics rushed to attend to them, and Richard handed the girl over to medical care, watching as she was taken to an ambulance. "Her mother," he heard someone say. "She's badly injured, already taken to the hospital." Richard remained there, observing the firefighters' work. his expensive clothes ruined, his breathing still labored. People approached to thank him, to call him a hero, but he barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the ambulance that was taking the girl away. "Which hospital did they take her to?" he asked one of the paramedics. "St. Luke's Hospital," the man replied. Without saying anything else, Richard returned to his car. He looked at the clock. 12:15 a.m. The meeting with the investors would start in less than 8 hours, but for the first time in his adult life, that didn't seem important. He started the car and headed towards the hospital without exactly understanding why. What Richard didn't know was that that night would change his life forever, and that the girl he had just saved held a secret that would shake the foundations of everything he had built up to that point. St. Luke's Hospital was surprisingly busy. For that time of night, Richard walked through the emergency doors still in his charred clothes and disheveled hair, a sight that contrasted drastically with his usual impeccable appearance. The smell of smoke impregnated in his clothes mixed with the characteristic antiseptic of the hospital environment. "I need information about the girl who was brought in from the fire," he said to the receptionist, his voice still hoarse from the smoke he had inhaled. "Are you a relative?" "No, I got her out of the building." The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh, you're the man who saved her. She's being treated in pediatrics, 2nd floor." In the elevator, Richard wondered what he was doing there. He had no obligation to follow up on the case. He had already done more than anyone would expect from a stranger. Still, something compelled him to continue, a force he couldn't explain. On the 2nd floor, he found a small waiting room where some people were waiting for news of the fire victims. A nurse approached, carrying a clipboard. "Are you Richard Miller?" she asked. When he nodded, she continued. "The girl is fine, physically. Just some minor scrapes and smoke inhalation, but nothing serious. She asked about you." "She asked about me?" "Yes, she wants to thank the man in the nice suit who saved her." The nurse smiled. "Do you want to see her?" Before he could answer, a social worker approached. "Mr. Miller? I'm Deborah Adams. We need to talk about Sophie's situation." Sophie, so that was her name. Her mother, Amy Sinclair, is in serious condition. She suffered severe burns and inhaled a lot of smoke trying to reach her daughter. She's in an induced coma, Deborah explained. "At the moment, we haven't been able to locate any other family members." The name caused Richard to shudder. Amy Sinclair. It couldn't be. "Amy Sinclair," he repeated, his voice betraying an emotion he hadn't shown in a long time. Did she work as an architect?" "Yes, she works on social housing projects. Do you know her?" Richard had to sit down. Memories he had kept locked away for years began to emerge. A summer 9 years ago, an intense romance, and an abrupt separation when the fear of commitment spoke louder than his heart. "I knew her," he answered simply. "A long time ago." The social worker observed him curiously. "Mr. Miller, I know you've already done a lot tonight, but we need help. Sophie has nowhere to stay, and the temporary shelter—" "No," Richard interrupted, surprising himself. "She's not going to a shelter. She can stay with me until her mother recovers." The words left his mouth before he could fully process them. It was an impulsive offer, something totally out of character for him, but something inside him knew it was the right thing to do. "Sir, I appreciate your generosity, but there are procedures. We would need to verify—" "I'm Richard Miller, from Miller Developments. You can do all the necessary checks. I have more than adequate conditions to take care of her temporarily." While the social worker made some calls, Richard was authorized to see Sophie. She was sitting on the hospital bed, still hugging the singed teddy bear. Her brown eyes, identical to her mother's, fixed on him as soon as he entered the room. "Hi," she said, with a surprisingly firm voice for someone who had been through so much. "Thank you for saving me." Richard felt something break inside him. Those eyes. There was something familiar about them, something that went beyond the resemblance to Amy. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. "How are you feeling?" "I'm okay, but I'm worried about Mommy." She hugged the bear tighter. "Do you know my mum? I heard the nurse saying you mentioned her name." Richard hesitated. "I knew her. A long time ago." Sophie studied him with disconcerting intensity. "You look like the photo." "What photo?" "The one my mom keeps in her drawer. She thinks I don't know, but I've seen it. It's an old photo of you and her." Richard's heart raced. Before he could respond, Deborah returned to the room. "Mr. Miller, we've done the preliminary checks. If you're still willing, we can start." "The procedures for temporary guardianship. We'll need some documents." Richard barely heard the social worker's words. His mind was on the implications of what Sophie had just said, on the dates that were beginning to align in his head, on the familiar look that now observed him with curiosity. "How long?" Sophie asked, her small voice interrupting the adults. "How long what, sweetie?" Deborah replied. "How long until my mum wakes up?" A heavy silence fell over the room. It was Richard who answered, surprising everyone with the gentleness in his voice. "We don't know yet, Sophie. But your mom is strong, very strong. I knew her, remember? And while she recovers, if you want, you can stay at my house. I have a guest room and we can—" "Do you have a pool?" Sophie interrupted, a small smile appearing on her face for the first time. Richard couldn't help but smile in response. "Yes, there's a pool. And can I bring Stevie?" "Stevie?" She held up the singed bear. "That's his name. Mom said a special friend chose the name, but she never told me who." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He had given that bear to Amy, naming it after Stevie Wonder, her favorite singer. The date, the bear, the familiar eyes. Everything was starting to make a sense that both terrified and amazed him at the same time. "Of course Stevie can come," he replied, his voice slightly trembling. "He's part of the family." The word family echoed in his mind as he watched Sophie hug the bear tighter. His phone vibrated in his pocket, probably Sarah trying to remind him of the meeting with the investors. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Miller completely ignored a professional obligation. There were much more important issues to resolve, truths to discover, and a growing feeling that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. Richard's penthouse duplex in Manhattan, one of New York's most upscale neighborhoods, never seemed so empty as when he opened the door for Sophie. The 6,000 square foot apartment, decorated with designer pieces and contemporary artwork, looked more like a museum than a home. "Wow!" exclaimed Sophie, still clutching Stevie, looking in wonder at the panoramic view of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It's like we're flying." "Your room is this way," said Richard, guiding her down the hallway. He had asked his housekeeper, Mrs. Johnson, to hurriedly prepare the guest room. "I hope you like it." The room, like the entire apartment, was minimalist and in neutral tones. Sophie entered hesitantly, her small steps echoing on the marble floor. She placed her improvised backpack, with some clothes they had managed to salvage from the apartment, on the king-size bed. "It's big," she commented, her voice small in the immense space. "But it needs color." Richard observed the environment through her eyes, and for the first time realized how cold and impersonal everything was. "We can fix that. What color do you like?" "Pink, and purple, and blue, and yellow." She began to list, her eyes shining. "I think we can take care of that tomorrow," he replied, checking his watch. It was already past 3 in the morning. "Now you need to rest." "I'm not sleepy," Sophie protested, even as a yawn betrayed her. "I want to see my mom." The mention of Amy made Richard's heart tighten. "We'll go back to the hospital tomorrow, I promise. But now you need to sleep." After much negotiation and the promise that they could have breakfast at the corner bakery, Sophie finally agreed to lie down. Richard waited until she fell asleep, before leaving the room, leaving the door ajar. In his office, he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. His cell phone showed 47 missed calls. Sarah, his father, the board of directors, journalists. The fire and his heroic act were already news, and his absence from the investors' meeting was certainly causing a stir. That's when he noticed an email that made him sit up straight in his chair. It was from Marcus Alden, his biggest rival in the real estate market. Interesting how fate works, isn't it? The great Richard Miller saving a child from a fire in one of his own company's buildings. "Have you checked the conditions of the building? It would be a shame if the press discovered certain irregularities. Richard frowned. The building where Amy and Sophie lived did indeed belong to one of Miller Development's subsidiaries, but it was managed by a third-party company. How did Marcus know about this so quickly? His thoughts were interrupted by a scream coming from Sophie's room. He ran there, finding her sitting up in bed, eyes wide and breathing heavily. "Hey, it's okay," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It was just a nightmare. There was so much fire," she whispered, hugging Stevie tightly, "and Mommy was screaming." Not knowing exactly what to do, Richard hesitantly extended his arm and touched her shoulder. To his surprise, Sophie threw herself into his arms, sobbing. He tensed for a moment, unaccustomed to physical contact, but gradually relaxed, hugging her back. "You know what my mom does when I have a nightmare?" Sophie asked, still between sobs. "What?" "She tells stories. Happy stories." Richard swallowed, hard. "Well, I'm not very good with stories, but can you tell me how you met my mom?" The question caught him off guard. Sophie was staring at him with those eyes that were a mirror of his own, something he could no longer deny. It was at an architecture exhibition," he began hesitantly. "Your mother was presenting an incredible social housing project. She spoke with such passion that everyone stopped to listen." "And you fell in love with her?" Sophie asked, her eyes now curious. Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Your mother is a very special person. Why did you leave?" The innocent question hit Richard like a punch. How to explain to a 7-year-old child that he had run away out of fear, that he had chosen his ambition over love? "Sometimes adults make mistakes," he answered simply. "Big mistakes." Sophie studied him for a moment, with a wisdom beyond her years. "But now you're back." "Yes, now I'm back." When Sophie finally fell asleep again, Richard remained by her side, watching her calm breathing. His cell phone vibrated once more. Another email from Marcus Alden. "You know that trusted employee of yours, Paul Sanders? Interesting how he's been making frequent visits to the office of the building's management company. And even more interesting are the deposits in his account." Richard felt a chill. Paul had been his right-hand man for years. The idea of internal betrayal, added to the insinuations about the fire, began to form a disturbing picture. He looked at Sophie sleeping and made a silent promise. He would discover the truth about the fire, protect his daughter, and try to fix the mistakes of the past. But first he needed to deal with an emergency board meeting scheduled for a few hours from now, where he would certainly have to explain not only his absence from the investors' meeting, but also his sudden guardianship of an unknown child. The sun was beginning to rise over New York, and with it, a new reality was unfolding for Richard Miller. A reality where financial statements and hostile takeovers would have to share space with teddy bears and nightmares, where his frozen heart was beginning, slowly, to thaw. The boardroom of Miller Developments was packed when Richard entered, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. The murmur of conversations ceased immediately. 12 pairs of eyes stared at him, mixing surprise and disapproval. "Son." The deep voice of Augustus Miller, his father, cut through the silence. "How nice of you to grace us with your presence." Richard ignored the sarcasm and took his place at the head of the table. Before he could speak, Sarah rushed into the room. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Sophie woke up and is asking, for you, Mrs. Johnson can't—" "Who is Sophie?" Augustus interrupted, his eyebrows arched. "The girl he rescued from the fire," answered Paul Sanders, the financial director, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's in all the newspapers. Our CEO has become a hero." Richard studied Paul carefully, remembering Marcus's email. His former right-hand man seemed different. There was something calculating in his gaze that he had never noticed before. "Sarah, tell Mrs. Johnson to take Sophie to the bakery as promised. I'll be home as soon as possible." Turning to the board, he continued, "Gentlemen, I know I owe you explanations." "Explanations?" Augustus laughed humorlessly. "You missed the meeting with our biggest investors to play firefighter, and now we find out you've brought a stranger into your home. What happened to you, Richard?" "That stranger is a 7-year-old child whose mother is in a coma," Richard replied, his voice icy. "And that building that caught fire? It's ours. under our responsibility. A heavy silence fell over the room. Paul cleared his throat. Actually, the management is outsourced. Legally, we don't have... I'm not interested in the legal part, Richard cut him off. I'm interested in the human part. People almost lost their lives yesterday. Since when do you care about the human part? His father provoked. You built your empire by being exactly the opposite. Cold, calculating, efficient. Maybe it's time for a change. The discussion that followed was heated. Richard presented an action plan to assist the families affected by the fire and proposed a complete audit of all the company's properties. Paul argued that this would affect the quarter's profits. Augustus seemed increasingly furious. Richard's phone vibrated, a message from Mrs. Johnson. Sophie didn't want to go to the bakery without you. She's sad. Excuse me, gentlemen, said Richard, standing up. I have an urgent appointment. Richard, Augustus thundered. If you walk out that door now... What? You'll disinherit me? Do what you did to Mom when she tried to show you there was life beyond work? Augustus's face paled. It was the first time Richard had mentioned his mother in a meeting. She had left when he was a teenager, tired of living with a man who prioritized business above all else. Don't make the same mistakes I did, said Augustus, his voice suddenly tired. No, Dad, I'm trying not to make my own. When he arrived home, he found Sophie curled up on the couch, still in her pajamas, watching cartoons with Stevie. Sorry I'm late, he said, sitting next to her. Do you still want to go to the bakery? Sophie shook her head. I want to see my mom. Of course, I'll just change clothes and... No, she grabbed his sleeve. Now. Richard looked at his wrinkled clothes and sighed. All right. Now. On the way to the hospital, Sophie finally spoke. Why don't you like your dad? How? I heard you talking on the phone earlier. You sounded angry. Richard chose his words carefully. Sometimes people in the same family can have very different ideas about what's important in life. Like what? Like work and money versus time with those we love. Sophie was silent for a moment. My mom always says money can't buy hugs. Richard felt something break inside him. How many hugs had he missed in his pursuit of success? At the hospital, while Sophie visited Amy, who remained in a coma, Richard received another disturbing message, this time from an anonymous source. Look in the management company's files, Phoenix Project. Your mother tried to stop it 25 years ago. The project name hit him like lightning. He vaguely remembered hearing that name when he was a teenager, shortly before his mother left. Mr. Miller? The nurse's voice brought him back. We found something strange in Ms. Sinclair's room, a threatening letter left a few days before. The fire. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside there was only one sentence. The Phoenix Project cannot be revealed. Take care of your daughter. His heart raced. So Amy knew. She knew he was Sophie's father. And apparently, she also knew something about a project that someone wanted to keep secret, something his own mother had fought against years ago. Uncle Richard, Sophie's voice called from the door of the room. She still called him Uncle, although her eyes identical to his told a different story. Mommy squeezed my hand, just a little, but she did. Richard tucked the letter into his pocket and forced a smile. He needed to uncover the truth about the Phoenix Project and its connection to the fire. But first he had a promise to keep. How about we go buy paint for your room? Pink, purple, blue and yellow, right? Sophie's smile lit up the gloomy hospital corridor, and for the first time in his adult life, Richard Miller realized that there were things much more valuable than the power and money he had pursued for so long. The paint and decor store had never seen anything like it. Richard Miller, the powerful businessman always dressed in Italian suits, now wore jeans and a polo shirt, pushing a cart full of colorful paint cans while a 7-year-old girl bounced around him. And those wall butterflies, exclaimed Sophie, pointing to a section of decorative stickers. Can we put them on the ceiling so I'll sleep looking at them? Sure, Richard replied, surprising himself with the ease with which the words came out. A week ago, the idea of decorative butterflies in his minimalist penthouse would have been unthinkable. How about the ones that glow in the dark? Sophie's eyes shone brighter than any fluorescent sticker could. There are butterflies that glow, In the dark? As Sophie chose the stickers, Richard checked his cell phone. 3 more anonymous messages had arrived. Office 237 Central Management. Red folder. Your mother tried to expose it 25 years ago. History repeats itself. As new. Documents prove it. As Amy Sinclair. Richard's heart raced. Uncle Richard? Sophie's voice brought him back. She was holding a small Star mobile. Mommy has one just like this at home. She said it was a gift from someone special. Richard swallowed hard. He had given that mobile to Amy on the last night they spent together, promising he would return from vacation with an engagement ring. And a promise he never kept. We'll take this one too, he said, taking the mobile. Back at the apartment, they found Mrs. Johnson organizing the purchases. The housekeeper, who had worked for Richard for years, had never seen him so different. You sure you want to paint the room today, sir? She asked, looking at the paint cans. You have that important meeting at 4. The meeting can wait, Richard replied, already rolling up his sleeves. First, we have a room to transform. The following hours were filled with laughter, paint stains, and discoveries. Richard learned that his daughter, it was still strange to think of her that way, had a laugh identical to Amy's. He also discovered that she had inherited his stubbornness, insisting on painting a wall by herself, even though she was too small to reach the top. Let me help you, he offered, lifting her onto his shoulders. Sophie screamed with joy, brushing the top of the wall with vibrant pink. That's when his cell phone rang. It was Paul Sanders. Boss, we need to talk. It's about the Phoenix project. Richard carefully put Sophie down. Sophie, how about we take a break for a snack? Mrs. Johnson can make that special hot chocolate of hers. As soon as Sophie left with the housekeeper, Richard answered the call. What do you know about the project? He asked without preamble. Not over the phone, Paul replied. Meet me at the corner cafe in 15 minutes. And Richard, be careful. Marcus isn't alone in this. Richard looked at his paint-stained hands. I need half an hour. Why? I need to finish painting a room. The silence on the other end of the line was eloquent. After finishing the wall with Sophie and promising he would return soon to put up the butterflies, Richard headed to the cafe. He found Paul sitting in a discreet corner, nervously fiddling with his cup. Your mother discovered it 25 years ago, Paul began without preamble. The Phoenix project was a scheme. Old buildings, precarious conditions purposely maintained, accidental fires, reconstruction with insurance money. What are you talking about? Your mother found the documents. She tried to expose it. That's when Augustus threatened her. She didn't run away, Richard. She was forced to leave. Richard felt his blood freeze. And Amy, what did she discover? The same thing. She was investigating social housing projects when she found the pattern. The same buildings, the same coincidences. She tried to reach out to you before the fire. How do you know all this? Paul lowered his eyes. Because I helped Marcus. At first it was just small information, then a waiter approached with more coffee, interrupting the confession. When he walked away, Paul seemed even more nervous. I need to go, I've said too much. But Richard, there's something you need to know about your mother. The sound of screeching tires on the street interrupted the sentence. A black car sped by, windows closed. Paul stood up abruptly. Office 237, red folder. Find it before. He stopped, turning pale. I need to go protect Sophie. Richard returned home dazed. He found his daughter sleeping on the couch, Stevie firmly hugged, pink paint stains on her cheeks. Next to her, a drawing. 3 stick figures, one big, one small, and one lying on something that looked like a hospital bed. Family, said the caption in childish handwriting. His cell phone vibrated with a message from Sarah. Urgent extraordinary meeting called by your father. Topic, presidency succession. Another message arrived right after, this time from the anonymous number. Your mother is alive, and she knows where the evidence is. Richard looked at the sleeping Sophie, at the family drawing, at his own hands stained with pink paint. Somewhere, his mother was alive, keeping secrets that could destroy everything. Somewhere there was a red folder with the truth about the Phoenix project. But at that moment, all that mattered was the small figure asleep on the couch and the promise to Stick glow-in-the-dark butterflies on the ceiling of her new room. "Come on, princess," he whispered, picking her up. "Let's finish decorating your room." Sophie snuggled into his neck, murmuring in her sleep, "I love you, Daddy." It was the first time she had called him that. And for the first time in his life, Richard Miller knew exactly what his priorities were. A year had passed since the revelations of the Phoenix Project. The headquarters of the former Miller Developments, now renamed New Home Foundation, was unrecognizable. The cold mirrors on the walls had given way to colorful murals, and the once austere lobby now displayed photos of smiling families in their new homes. Richard walked through the place, greeting employees by name, a habit that would have seemed unthinkable in the past. He arrived at the meeting room where Amy was waiting for him, surrounded by plants and projects. "The residents of Hope Gardens approved the renovation project," she announced, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We'll start the work next month." "And the families from the old building?" "All relocated in much better conditions, exactly as we promised." Richard smiled, admiring how Amy had transformed the social projects department into the backbone of the new company. The foundation now dedicated itself exclusively to social housing and community revitalization. "Sophie is already anxious for today's party," Amy commented. She helped Helen choose every detail of the decoration. The party. Richard still got emotional thinking about the reason for the celebration, the inauguration of the Helen Miller Cultural Center, built on the site of the old building that had burned down. The center would offer professional courses and cultural activities for the community. "And how is he?" Amy asked softly. Richard knew she was referring to his father. Augustus had served 6 months of house arrest and was now participating in HISE, a rehabilitation program. "Getting better," he replied. "Sophie visits him twice a week. She's really helping him learn to tell happy stories." The sound of children's laughter interrupted the conversation. Sophie ran into the room, followed by Helen. "Dad? Mom? Look what Grandma taught me to make." She proudly showed an origami butterfly. "We're going to hang a bunch of them in the cultural center." "It's beautiful, Princess," Richard praised. "Like the ones in your room?" "Better, because these will be for everyone to see." Helen approached, carrying more colored papers. "She has the same artistic talent you had at her age, son. And the same determination as her mother," added Amy. "And Grandma's wisdom," Sophie added, making everyone laugh. Mrs. Johnson appeared at the door. "Miss Sophie, your grandfather has arrived." Augustus Miller entered the room hesitantly. He was different. The impeccable suits had given way to more casual clothes, and his eyes, once cold, now carried a new softness. "Grandpa!" Sophie ran to hug him. "I learned to make butterflies. Do you want to learn too?" "Of course, little one." He sat down with her, watching her instructions attentively. "You know, this reminds me of when your father was a child. He also loved to create things. And why did you stop?" The innocent question made all the adults look at each other. It was Helen who answered. "Sometimes we forget what's important, dear. But the best thing about life is that we can always remember again." "Like you and Daddy?" "Exactly," Richard replied, hugging his mother. "And now we have all the time in the world to make up for it." The afternoon progressed as the family prepared for the inauguration. The cultural center was full of people from the community, many of whom had been directly affected by the Phoenix Project. But today was not a day to remember sorrows. It was a day to celebrate new beginnings. Richard climbed onto the improvised stage to give his speech. He looked at the audience. His mother, strong and wise; Amy, his rediscovered love; Sophie, his greatest treasure; his father, seeking redemption; Mrs. Johnson, an inseparable part of the family; and all the people who were now part of this new story. "A year ago," he began, "I believed that success was measured in numbers and power. Today I've learned that true success is in the smiles we provoke, the lives we transform, and the love we share." Sophie, sitting in the front row, raised her paper butterfly. Soon, dozens of other colorful butterflies rose through the audience, a surprise organized by Helen. "This center," Richard continued, emotional, "is not just a building. It's a symbol of transformation, of how it's possible to transform pain into hope, fear into courage, and loneliness into family." Amy joined him on stage, followed by Helen. Sophie ran to hug her father's legs. Even Augustus timidly approached. Because in the end, Richard concluded, it's not the buildings we construct that matter, but the bonds we create. It's not the financial empire we leave behind, but the legacy of love we plant. As the paper butterflies were released into the wind, dancing against the blue New York sky, Richard Miller finally understood. His true empire wasn't made of concrete and steel, but of his daughter's smiles, Amy's love, his mother's wisdom, and even his father's sincere repentance. It was an empire built with forgiveness, new beginnings, and above all with that which money could never buy. The warmth of a family embrace.